Recently, there's been a lot of discussion about the repatriation of colonial collections that are held in museums. So when I'm talking about colonial collections, I mean collections that were gathered under conditions of colonialism and then brought back to the colonizing country. So for example, artifacts that were gathered in Africa during colonialism and then they've been held in European museums since then. So part of the discussion about repatriation is the argument that because these objects were gathered under colonial conditions, they were coercively gathered, or sometimes they were stolen or even looted. But because they were illegitimately obtained, they can't continue to be held legitimately either, and so they need to be returned to source communities. So that's the repatriation argument. And in fact, some of these objects have started to go back to their source countries. So I've been looking at a collection of human remains that were gathered by German scientists and explorers from the territory of what is now Rwanda in the early 1900s. So this was the period of German colonialism in Rwanda. And those were gathered in Rwanda and brought back to Germany, and they've been held in Berlin in various cultural institutions ever since. But in recent years, there have been some discussions about returning them, and it seems possible that they're actually going to go back to Rwanda. And a lot of scholarship has focused on that moment of return, the moment of repatriation. But what I'm interested in is what if we think about repatriation not as an endpoint, not just as a goal, but also as a midpoint in this process. And we focus on what happens once objects are returned, what kind of possibilities does that open up for the future? So once heritage objects are returned, they can actually be reintegrated into society. So when I'm talking about heritage, I'm not talking just about objects that are frozen on one museum shelf and they get sent to another museum shelf where they're continue to be frozen and isolated and nobody cares about them. Heritage objects can actually be part of social processes and they can have a lot of meaning and value in society. So once objects are returned and they're reintegrated into society, they can become building blocks. They can be used and mobilized for social and political processes. Heritage constitutes a usable past that can actually be mobilized and used in the service of making something new. So for example, in some of my previous research in Rwanda, I spoke to people in the heritage sector who were using heritage to derive what they called the future we want, or the Rwanda we want. And what they meant by that was they were using pre-colonial heritage to create a unified Rwandan identity. And the idea was that this would then replace divisive ethnic identities that had led to conflict in the past, and this would build a different Rwanda going forward. Repatriation can serve as part of a decolonizing effort. And so decolonization doesn't just mean trying to right some of the wrongs of the colonial past, it's also about changing the dynamics of power going forward so that you can build a different kind of self-determined future. Going back to Germany and Rwanda, the question is, what kinds of new possibilities does this repatriation enable? When Rwanda once more has the heritage that was formerly taken from it, what kind of usable pasts are they going to be able to derive from this and serve what kinds of purposes going forward? And the key point is really that once these items are returned, those questions are going to be answered by Rwandans in the service of making their own self-determined future. Going past the moment of return lets us think about repatriation as more than just an ethical requirement or a historical corrective. Because when the material past is returned, that actually opens up new social possibilities for building a self-determined and decolonized future.